There are a number of concerns that China is using video games to influence users, harvest data, and shaping narratives in the online community. Now, to talk about this in more detail and some of the concerns this raises is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, who joins us once again from Los Angeles. Lisa, Beijing has barred those under the age of 18 from gaming on weekdays and limited their play to just 3 hours on weekends. But internationally, it's a whole different ballgame, with Chinese companies are aggressively expanding their market share. How concerning is this for us here in the West?
Yeah, absolutely concerning because we talk about China's sphere of influence. We talk about their ability to really penetrate all these different sectors and have influence. So it's not only that they are exporting the technology where they everything is made in China, but now they are the messaging, the propaganda, the subliminal, text is all owned by China. So they own our hearts and minds as well. Well, that, at least for the newer generation. So we talk about hard power and soft power. In this case, you talk about hard targets and soft targets. This is absolutely a way for China to make itself known, to control the dialogue. They are doing this all around the world. We always talk about how China goes into impoverished areas, for example, and says, you know what, we will put in your internet lines. But guess what? They own those internet lines, or we will do X, Y, and Z. But then they own that influence or that arena. Now they're doing that to the United States and the West, and these are young kids in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, all in our hemisphere that are relying on not only the technology, the hardware, but also the software and these games, and the shows and the TikTok, and the list goes on and on. So it's very important to focus on China as the largest growing threat. And I emphasize growing because there's not much attention paid to this. I will remind you that President Biden had a 3.5-hour conversation with China's president not too long ago, and none of this was brought up. The only thing that President Biden walked away with was, we don't think they're going to invade Taiwan, which again, we're not guaranteed. But how about all these different threats that are threatening us on a daily basis? And again, no mention of transparency for COVID, no transparency about their human rights abuses, and again, no transparency about copycat technology, about our military copycat, issues with them stealing military devices and copying them, and now, of course, the messaging in all of this technology that they own.
Police authorities in Iran have arrested one of the country's most celebrated actresses, an award-winning actress who is one of the stars of the film The Salesman. Who was arrested and what happened?
Yeah, this is, she's an Oscar-winning actress, quite iconic. And every time she would appear in award shows in the West, she would even keep her hair covered because she knew the consequences of not representing Iran's regime in the proper way by wearing her hijab, even outside of Iran's borders. Now she's taking a stand, and where on Instagram, she posted a picture of herself with the sign saying "Women, Life, Freedom," which is the slogan of this current movement in Iran. And she has been arrested merely for providing support for peaceful protesters. I emphasize this because, where's the West? Where are the Women's March organizers? Where are the so-called champions of women's rights when we are watching women being brutally killed, rounded up, raped, abused in Iran merely for supporting a peaceful uprising? And again, here's an example. Not all stories are told. Over the weekend, the Foreign Desk did a roundup of women doctors who have secretly been murdered. Why? Because they were treating the injured protesters who were beaten up on the streets. I mean, it makes no sense to us here in the West. The only thing we can do is support them. And the fact that there's global silence is mind-boggling. The only thing we can do is share these stories and tell the stories of the Iran protesters and their revolution.
And of course, we're talking about the actress Tarana Al-Adousti. Now, Lisa, still with Iran, the Islamic Republic has banned 20 students from entering classes after they participated in the December 7th Students' Day rallies. They were protesting the death of the 22-year-old Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, who was in custody of Tehran's morality police.
Yes, again, just mind-boggling to think that students in a university here in the West, we award and we kind of praise any college students who are willing to think for themselves and to stand up for what is right and social justice movements. And here you have Iran college students, some of the finest universities across that country, who were standing up merely in a peaceful protest and are now banned from attending classes. So their future is now being jeopardized merely for attending peaceful protests. And I will tell you how that number is exponentially higher for students who have not been able to return to class or were rounded up. I will also remind you that in the beginning of this revolution, there was the attack on Sharif University, which is one of, if not the most prestigious science and math university in Iran, where regime forces, kind of broke their way through the college gates. They closed those gates. They didn't allow any of the students to escape the dormitories. They rounded up students in unmarked vans and took them off. And who knows what the fate of those students are? Nobody has followed up. Nobody knows what happens to them. The media certainly can't get access to this information. So there's obviously a fixation on young people in this revolution, high school students, college students, men and women, leading the revolution and saying all we want are our basic freedoms.
Let's turn our attention now to the war in Ukraine. In an effort to boost the morale of Russian soldiers in Ukraine, the Kremlin says it's sending opera singers and circus performers to the front lines. Lisa, I guess it's safe to say the circus act continues.
What's better than for the morale of the soldiers who are dying in a war to just bring them home rather than send them clowns and singers and entertainment? This is, a crazy development in this already very, very crazy war, senseless war that's being fought with the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces. And of course, we're seeing a lot of tragic deaths on both sides, including Russian soldiers. So here's an idea, they're telling Russians to send in musical instruments, to volunteer if they are performers, to again boost the morale of these soldiers by sending entertainment onto the battlefield.
Veteran U.S. diplomat Henry Kissinger, a man who used to be the Secretary of State under U.S. Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, and who helped to broker a deal during the Cold War, is calling for negotiated peace in Ukraine. Lisa, Kissinger is 99 years old and still active in foreign diplomacy here.
Yeah, probably one of the most experienced statements when it comes to diplomacy and appeasement in a lot of ways. If you look at his record, is kind of speechless when it comes to what can be done about the Russian invasion in Ukraine. He's calling for a ceasefire. He's calling for peace talks. And of course, Russian President Putin is not even listening or is not going to entertain anything that requires him to back down, withdraw, or to issue a ceasefire before sitting down. He wants to win this war, and he's extremely clear about this. So anything that the West is offering, including Zelensky, who has many times said, let's sit down and talk about this. France tried to insert themselves, and the United States, of course, sending lots of aid and money to Ukraine and showing, obviously that they support Zelensky in this invasion. But the sanctions, the pressure, nothing has worked. So, there are many leaders across the world that are calling for not just a ceasefire, but to sit down and have talks to broker some sort of peace, again, in this very senseless war.
Lisa, officials in North Korea say they conducted a very important final stage test for the development of a reconnaissance satellite. Now, that was the day after its neighboring country said that North Korea launched 2 ballistic missiles toward the Sea of Japan.
Right. So Japan is getting very nervous about these developments in North Korea. The West not paying so much attention, particularly the Biden White House has not mentioned the North Korean threat in a very long time. But meanwhile, Kim Jong-un knows that he is playing out the clock with the Biden administration, doing whatever they can, announcing different missile tests every day. As you mentioned, this is a final test. That means there have been several series in this latest development. And again, we see South Korea, Japan getting very nervous in that part of the world, watching North Korea expand its power and to make these very bold announcements with their missile tests. We don't know what will be next, but of course, this is something to keep an eye on in terms of its development.
Here's an interesting holiday story. A man who was overheard yelling Allahu Akbar has been accused of cutting down a Christmas tree installed by a French town hall earlier this week, and he was subsequently arrested by police.
It's crazy. A 39-year-old man out in the outskirts of Bordeaux, France, says Allahu Akbar, cuts down a tree, a Christmas tree, obviously a symbolic hit on Christianity by an Islamist extremist. We've seen a lot of these stories, particularly in France. If you remember, years back, there was a car ramming in a Christmas marketplace. There have been many attacks on Christians in this part of the world. They kind of exported the war on Christians from the Middle East now into Europe. If you're following the news, Christianity has been, under persecution in many parts of the Middle East. The Foreign Desk actually had an annual campaign called My Treedom, instead of My Freedom, where we would post Christmas trees from around the world, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, where Christianity is forbidden. The practice of Christmas, the celebration of Christmas, is forbidden because of this fixation by extremists to cancel Christmas. So imagine in places like Iran or Sudan and other parts of the Middle East, they would have to smuggle Christmas trees while they were vacationing in other parts of the world in their suitcases and then put it up, and then secretly put it up, because if it would be confiscated, there would be a jail time for practicing Christianity, which is forbidden in many parts of the world. So here is a very open attack on Christianity. I know it looks like a little side story, but it is in fact an attack on Christians, on Christianity, on Christmas, and a very important story.
As long as we don't forget that Christ is the reason for the season, that we celebrate Christmas here. Lisa, closer to home, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security says more migrants may be released into the United States to pursue immigration cases when the Trump-era asylum restrictions end. Tell me more.
Yeah, so this is an end of Title 42, which will end on Wednesday. It will expire. This is a legal aid that was put into place by the Trump administration in March of 2020 to slow the flow of migrants into the country because of COVID. It was done actually in the 40s to slow the spread of influenza, and again used as a measure by the Trump administration to slow COVID coming into the country. And the Biden administration actually extended it till now, which will expire on Wednesday. Now imagine the number of migrants we have coming into the country daily, and that's with this measure in place. Now imagine when this measure expires on Wednesday, what influx we are expecting, and how you and I have spoken about, this domino effect coming in from countries like Guatemala and Venezuela and Ecuador and other places into Mexico. So they're not just from Mexico, and then coming into the country, and more recently trickling further north into Canada as well. So it is something that is affecting the entire hemisphere, and it will continue to be to exacerbate because of the numbers. And again, because of this protection, this legal protection being removed, they are expecting a huge influx and growth in numbers from our southern border.
She's one of our regular contributors, Lisa Daftari of the Foreign Desk. Thanks so much for joining us today from Los Angeles.
My pleasure.